where to start? The preamble for this presentation comes from the utter frustration that I have with rolling out open source and open standards based software and technology in a large public sector organisation. So at the sort of when I started in 2014 as the CIO with the public health service. I was with the private health service in Townsville before that, and there was a number of projects I wanted to do, and I thought, once I finally got to the top tier of IT management, I thought I'd have enough prowess, political capital to get my own way. Much to my dismay, that's not the case, especially working for the public sector, because obviously we have agencies and governance layers above us. So at the beginning of the year, I actually started writing all of these excuses down in the back of my diary, just because I thought it'd be a cute little exercise in sort of trying to keep me sane. And towards the end of the year, they actually started grouping together. So not with any sort of scientific method at all. I put together a list of the 10 most common barriers, is the polite way of saying, excuses, some might say, or basically crap that people say why you can't do open source technology. And if you want to know, number 1 had about 86 hits, and number 10 had about 4 hits. So that's sort of the range. I'm not going to tell you what the N is and all that sort of stuff, because it's not actually proper statistics. So, who are we? We're a public health service that covers 23,000 times the size of Singapore. That's the health service area. We're also a tertiary referring hospital for that sort of green triangle rhombus shaped thing there. So we get tertiary referrals from Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, bits of Micronesia, that sort of stuff. So we're big. And it's a fun hospital to work for and health service, because we get a lot of really different cases. The static population of our catchment area for our secondary and tertiary is about 300,000. So obviously probably about one fifth of the population of 1/20th of the population of Singapore. We employ about 6,000 staff. It's about 2/3 clinical, 1/3 administrative in rough terms. We provide 65,000 inpatient occasions, so that's people who actually obviously get admitted to hospital. And we have more than 62,000 emergency department attendances each year. Gives you an idea of how big the organisation is. I have a long sordid history in open source. I was part of the formation of a software startup in 1996. We did quite a lot of open source technology, quite a lot of open source development. It went incredibly well for many years, then went incredibly badly for a number of years. Those years were 2000, 2001. So I moved on with the Australian Overseas Aid Service. I worked in Vanuatu, and as a side project I set up the first free mail exchange server in Vanuatu, which was used to provide basic email services, just a dial-up email service. We will send mail server kicking on in the background. Certainly changed a lot of things. Really cute application of a small technology that made a big difference, because finally NGOs in non-government organisations in Vanuatu were able to actually use email and join the rest of, say, the donor organisations in sending and receiving email. I used to I used to lead a political party in Australia called the Australian Democrats in the ACT. It's the president of the branch there. And we were actually successful in 2004 in getting open source legislation through the Legislative Assembly, basically by changing the Procurement Act, that basically the government needed to actually look at open source software first before procuring proprietary software. Didn't really do much good, but we had a good tilt at it. In 2006, I was with the World Bank sort of backed funding system with Australian Overseas Volunteers again, and we put together a P&G Coffee Corporation logistics system. We were able to raise the farm gate price of coffee by about 5 to 10%, which was quite good for them. Obviously that's the main thing that they involve. I was in Cambodia in 2009, helped with the development of Moon OS. It's not really going as well as it used to, but it was the first Cambodian language operating system around, which did quite a lot of good things. And obviously currently I'm the CIO of Townsville Hospital and Health Service. I'm not going, look at me, but I just wanted to say I am actually deeply committed to open source technologies and the the use of open source, what would you say, open source methodology to try and get outcomes for organisations. I'm not a hardcore coder or programmer in any way, but I guess I sold my soul to being management now, so I can't really go back. Number one reason, difficulty. Like I said, it scored 86 or 84 times in the back of the diary. Three main reasons: it's tricky for the uninitiated user to use. User interfaces are far inferior to those of other operating systems. Not that anyone really uses them, or in my workspace. It's just not what I'm used to. So the first barrier that we're up against is basically an uninformed user base that doesn't really understand the opportunities that there are with open source, mitigating the challenges of actually using it. I'm going to go through the slides reasonably quickly because at LinuxConf I ran a similar situation, a similar scenario, and we had a lot of questions and I didn't have enough time, so I'm going to try and get through this fairly quickly, and then there looks like a lot of informed people here, so it'd be great to have a bit of discussion about what your thoughts are on them. The second, it's the default, and this is mostly your technical people that give you this. The exchange of documents with suppliers or customers or internal people. Proprietary software vendors have already gone into things like universities and training colleges and trained the students to use their software. This was a large problem in the engineering sector in Australia because there's a particular AutoCAD developer and vendor that will actually give the licenses for free and the software for free to the students, so that by the time they actually get into the engineering firms, they don't want to use anything else because it costs them too much productivity, even if there is a mandated company default software. Not identical in terms of functionality, user interface, performance, plugins, yada yada yada. That's a little bit of a bleed from the last slide, but the reason it's in this one is that basically people get used to using things in a particular way and don't really want to commit any extra training. In an organisation like a health service, you quite often have people coming to you saying, well, you're putting in this new software, what sort of training are you going to provide? What are you going to do? And those sorts of things. It's interesting that computer literacy and literacy within information systems isn't actually considered to be a core part of people's jobs or a skill that they need to maintain. For example, a nurse needs to continue to have basic life support. She needs to know, well, they need to know how to do CPR and give mouth-to-mouth, those sorts of things, and that's just part of their job. They need to keep that training up to date to keep their job. However, IT skills and literacy is not one of those things. It's an interesting dichotomy in the zeitgeist. Number three, support. You would have thought it was number one, but it actually comes in at number three. Paying for guaranteed vendor response. Admittingly, the open source sector isn't very developed in Australia, and often we lack large, or what would be considered to be large, organisations to actually back software to provide solutions for the organisation. Free Libre open source community. So obviously the acronyms change. FOSS, Libre, or open source are interchangeable in our community. So I'm just going to stick with FLOS at the moment. Community responds quickly to queries posted on forums and pages, but yet, and the ... after that is, but yet you can't pay them to do so. Well, that's the idea that was put forward at that particular time. Externalising risk by giving projects to separate third parties. So it's almost like a catch-22. Because there aren't any large vendors of open source software, there's a catch-22. We can't externalise our risk. Now, within the public sector, as opposed to, say, the private sector or community sector, it's not so much financial reasons why organisations make decisions, or the financial impact, or those sorts of things. It often comes down to political capital and the willingness to actually risk one's own, profile within an organisation. So risk externalisation is a major underlying motivator for many of the public sector leaders that you're trying to actually commit to making open source purchases. And if they can't externalise the risk, it's a no-go, basically. Longevity. There's no guarantee that proprietary software vendor will stick with a product. And on the other way, small developers may not be around, is sort of the coefficient of that one. Yeah, that one's loaded, and I think I'll go on a side tangent if I go through and explain that too much. But that was an interesting one from one of my staff members. If an open source project is small, there's also a danger that the person behind it may lose interest. And any quick search of SourceForge will find many orphan projects. As I don't know who quoted it, it's probably an anonymous quote, but they always say that success has many fathers, but failure is the orphan. Large vendors are likely to be around in a few years and to honour their commitments they give you. Well, I don't exactly agree with it, but it's a reason that's often put forward by many public sector leaders why they don't want to adopt open source. This is actually not so much a reason why, but a reason sometimes to actually question whether or not something's actually open source. The cloud, which unfortunately words like the cloud, digital disruption, and innovative excellence get overused in the Australian public sector in its verbiage, and I'll probably vomit the next time I hear it used by an uninformed user. But basically, even if the hosted software is built entirely on open source software, you don't normally get access to the software anyway. Or to the code, I should say, the code base, either in escrow or in some other mechanism to make sure that if they were to go out of business, or if they were to be attacked, or any of those scenarios why you'd want to look at their source code or even quality control, you don't often get access to it because they just say, look, you're buying it as a service, you don't have rights to do that, those sorts of things. The benefits of using the cloud solution as a service model often outweigh the disadvantage of not having access to the source code. That's the counter argument for that. Is basically, if it ain't broke, who cares? I don't have to fix it. Why would I be worried about the source code? So yeah, let's use the cloud, but it doesn't really matter to me if it's open source cloud or if it's not open source cloud, or how much the vendor wants to put the code into, say, open forums and those sorts of things. That number 5 is one of the ones I get very passionate about in arguing and debating. Closed hardware. Well, obviously our session beforehand was a great leader into this, and I think most of the points were covered in the previous session. Proprietary hardware has specialised drivers. Often closed source is not available from the manufacturer. What's really interesting about that is that we have quite a lot of biomedical devices that are locked down like Fort Knox. And quite often when integrating a system into a hospital scenario, the biometric device or biomedical device may not actually work with, even though it might be running on, say, some sort of light Windows system or light Linux system, because the interfacing, even though there's HL7 and a number of standards, because it's proprietary, often they're standalone devices. So when trying to implement a electronic medical record and get, say, regular observations out of a particular bedside biometrical device, sometimes the vendor won't actually allow you to actually plug your interface layer or your middleware layer in with theirs. And there's a number of great examples of that on the internet. When I was working for an engineering firm, and that point number 3 is important, and our previous session was also, basically the developers don't have access to the actual code and the hardware, so therefore they find it very hard to build things for that hardware, and that then becomes an ongoing loop. You don't really know what the black box is doing. That's more of a thing why you should have open source, but sort of the counter argument from, there's that thing in the corner, it doesn't break, so we'll just trust it works, and it's got a big, stamp on it from a company that we trust, we'll just leave it alone. But literally my network, so on a tangent, I have about 140 staff, I have about 7,000 desktops and about, I think it's close to 10,000 devices on my network, as my slab of the network, and then obviously we have a wide area network which has about 90,000 devices on it. The amount of devices that I don't even know about, and it keeps me awake at night, and thank God I'm in Singapore, I can get some sleep, but where the manufacturer just actually has a VPN tunnel straight through into its box, and it's sitting in my network, and sure, I've got a quasi layer 2, layer 3 network sitting there and a bit of security, but hey, anyone in the room can tell you the security problems with that. Yeah, and that leads into the last point. Of course, the vendor needs 24/7 remote access. So, obviously, from the previous points, if they're a small open source vendor, they're probably not going to be there 24/7 if you need them. And B, you need to give them access all the time anyway. It's not like these devices. It's that sort of idea that you often get, that people think that if a biometric device goes down, then someone's going to die or something's going to happen. But in the end, people still make people better. Machines are only there as a tool. You know, I mean, it's a hard argument to win. Liability. I would have thought it came up higher, but it didn't, because people don't actually like to think of it this way. Warranties and liability indemnity matter a lot in a risk-adverse public sector, as I mentioned before. Many open source projects aren't backed by commercial organisations, i.e. they're hard to sue. Most organisations, public sector organisations, don't actually sue, but it's sort of that same zeitgeist that basically, you know, there's nobody there to be responsible. There's nobody we can go after if it really hits the fan, you know. And it's a major reason why people don't want to go with it. I would have thought that it would become number one, but people don't. You have to sort of tease it out of people and say, well, what is actually the reason why you don't want to go with an open source solution? And in the end, it is actually that sort of covering one's own reputation. Budget. Now this is a complex one that I've sort of jammed a couple of reasons together, so it doesn't really fit one particular sort of idea, but they all are financial, and it comes down to the way within Australia, and I think probably other countries have a similar sort of public sector budgeting cycle, that an organisation is given a certain amount of money and it really needs to expend that money by the end of the financial year, otherwise it won't get an increase in funding or a similar amount of funding. It's a common sort of issue. So a few things there. People think free when they see in front of open source. They think of free beer and not free as in freedom. So often it's very, very hard to actually get them to understand that you really should pay for your open source software even though you're not required to do so. I mean, obviously if there's some sort of professional services agreement that you can enter into with an organisation, then that's great. But even if you're using some cute little piece of software that someone's made and just chucked up on SourceForge or on GitHub, and you should probably donate to the project. It's just good citizenship. And in an organisation, especially public health, where being a good corporate citizen, I mean, there are many, there are many medical, for an example, there are many medical procedures that we do that were never fully paid for, whether by public funds or by private funds, yet we do them anyway because someone's going to die or someone's going to get hurt. So, you know, there's generally a culture, you would have thought a culture of basically of good corporate citizenship or good community citizenship. But as far as software goes, we're happy to rip off other people's IP and not pay for it. Budget structure is anti-open source. It's funny. It's something that I really tackle as a senior executive in a health service. If you can capitalise the money, i.e. it's a project expense, it happens, it's like purchasing some hardware or purchasing, if you say you're doing a project, software's a little bit hard with this sometimes, then it's far easier to get the money than if it's an operational cost. Because the underlying budget, in Australia we've got this what's called an efficiency dividend, which is basically that each public sector organisation needs to try and run more efficiently by 2% each year. And it's quite a anyway, that's another debate. So when I'm putting projects forward, if I can actually capitalise the project, i.e. I can make it a project, a proper project, sorry, I'm using big P and low and small p project, then I'm able to get it through the budget, and if I can keep it within a year, then it's just like purchasing a new wheel for the car. Done, you know, away we go. But because open source software, especially the smaller end, more of innovative stuff, tends to be done by small projects, and they really want you to pay them a monthly fee, which is what you want to do. It's very hard to capitalise. So there's this sort of counterintuitiveness to actually being able to support some of this innovation. And last one, if the open source solution is used to support critical applications quickly and cheaply, it often goes unrecognised and under-resourced. I can't tell you the amount of open source software and mostly open source software that just gets put in. Like people go, oh, I found this online, and I just run it and away we go. Whether that is a true open source, built, some sort of LAMP stack web server app or something, right through to someone's pinched some Excel code from someone else on the internet. It very rarely goes recognised that it's actually open source and that it's actually used. Anyway, I'm slowing down. I'll keep going. Segues very nicely into intellectual property. The need to protect the organisation from any intellectual property challenges from open source software. Basically, if something goes wrong, someone wants to sue us, and it was this piece of software, who's actually responsible? That chain of command, liability once again. Replace any code found to be in violation of intellectual property rights. So it's funny, most of these actually come from our procurement people, and they're pretty esoteric. But trying to actually purchase something, you've obviously got to go through the procurement people because they pay for things. And what often happens is they're very, very scared about the fact that if another company suddenly buys out another company, so like, I know, Oracle buying out Sun Microsystems was a big one for us a few years ago, then some of that code then becomes proprietary because it wasn't strictly under the GPL or some other mechanism at the time. Therefore, we have to start paying for it in the future. I don't know of one single case where that's actually happened, but our procurement people are actually quite worried about that. Maybe they studied at university during their degree or something, I don't know. If our own staff contribute to an open source project, who actually owns that intellectual property? We're a public sector organisation. I would say the public does. So and there are many mechanisms to do that. But we don't want to give our IP away just willy-nilly to anybody. Even though in the organisation we often, take intellectual property from other people and don't give them credit for it. So it's quite a bizarre, zeitgeist. And the last one, whose intellectual property is it anyway? It's often very, very hard to actually nail down who created it and who didn't, and those sorts of things. This isn't so much a reason, but it was two long conversations I had. And my stance is, as a public sector organisation, ought not public money go to supporting, open source solutions and open systems and providing code to the public other than to a company that's going to basically make profit? And unfortunately, the majority of software in healthcare is actually for-profit proprietary organisations that develop software on the public purse and then make a lot of money for it somewhere else. And so, anyway, I could go on about that one, but I won't. So that's my observations over the first, 2.5 years of being a CIO in a public sector organisation. A lot of those I was hoping would start a discussion and ask some questions, and so I'm happy to take any questions. Silence.
Yeah.
I thought some of them would be provocative.
Do we have questions? If not, okay. First of all, I work in a government-related agency, so this is pretty interesting to me, and we do research, so IP is obviously very important, and I was surprised that it came number 9 in this.
Indeed.
But one of the things that I have to deal with also is, not just open source adoption. We often see open source as a kind of a shortcut, or if it's already there and it's working well, we could use that. But there's a bit of a fear also about copyleft licenses, because then you can't sell that as your own IP because you have to give all this product that you just developed using with the aid of the GPL or with other similar licenses. You have to give that out for free because that's the terms of the license. Indeed.
And hence why so many new licenses have been made, your Apache licenses and your MIT licenses and stuff. Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. But then if you have dominant pieces of software like WordPress, for example, you can't really change the license on that.
No.
So we've had to find fairly obscure alternatives for a basic CMS function.
Wow.
And that's kind of it's a barrier to productivity, as some people would say.
Indeed. How many of you work in large organisations? Say more than 100 people. No? Got 1, 2. So what's how much open source do you work with each day?
Well, my job actually. Sorry, I work at Google and I do Google Smart Code and Google coding programs. So I'm working with actually a lot of open source organizations external to Google every day. That's my general job, is actually working with a lot of organizations that are represented here this weekend. But one of the things that we do at Google, like Kat mentioned earlier, is that we do a lot of releasing. Our open source team is in charge of making sure all of the licenses and everything are correct, so that our Googlers can release projects, open source code that they're working on.
Yeah, indeed.
In their spare time. So I don't know, as percentage-wise, I think
it's good to hear that Google actually does quite a lot of open source stuff. I guess often my frustration at coming to these sorts of events is that we in open source tend to be in our own little bubble sometimes, and I'm right at that crossroads every single day, fighting in the trenches to try and actually get people to use open source, and I just find it incredibly difficult to try and a cute story on the side is that LibreOffice. Okay, so Queensland Health was predominantly on an XP environment late last year. Project's now going through to actually clean out and go to Windows 7, which is a fantastic option. That's sarcasm. And we, through various leadership shortcomings, we only ended up with for the 90-odd thousand desktops. We only ended up with about 6,000 licenses for an Office upgrade. So from 2003 to 2010, which is of course then we have a have and have not sort of environment. And so my automatic answer was, well, there's LibreOffice. Let's just roll out LibreOffice. And so I had it packaged by my own team. I had it rolled out, and I just basically rolled it out to everybody. They're now in the process, even though they don't have a replacement for everybody for Windows 2010 to even go to 365 or something like that, they're now trying to actually claw back and discourage people from using LibreOffice because of their perceived threat that it causes with document version control and those sorts of things. Not that the jump from 2003 to 2010 wouldn't cause the same problem. So it's an interesting mix. And another, sorry, go ahead.
No, finish.
Oh no, I was going to start another story, which I can start.
Well, I guess related to this and maybe a few other topics. So you rolled out LibreOffice and relatively successfully, despite maybe some pushback. But did you have to overcome any of the challenges you mentioned here related to having a service provider, having someone to provide support? How did you rationalize that, or did you even have to? Right? People just kind of accepted it in that case.
It's mostly basically people were so desperate for something that was better that they just lapped it up. But I'm currently in a lot of conversations with people that are within Queensland there are 16 health services. So we're just one of 16. We're the third largest. So the two large hospitals are in Brisbane, our capital city, and my hospital's the largest. Actually, it's the largest hospital outside a capital city in Australia. So it's about a 650 bed facility plus 8 other 100-odd bed hospitals. And so when I take leadership on something, people kind of go, oh, because we're big. We're not the biggest, but we're big. And no, I'm currently in discussions with them about. But like I said, it comes back to that literacy argument. It's like, well, do you really need a vendor for an Office product? Shouldn't you just use it and get on with it? Obviously, we put through group policies and that sort of stuff. We made sure that it saved to 2003 first and that sort of stuff. But yeah, it's mitigation. Another great example though is we were using for our IT asset management the HP OpenView product, and we're transitioning at the moment away from that. And the new system that they're going to go to, I won't even discuss. But we sort of fell short of actually our asset control and those sorts, and licensing control. So I obviously quick market scan. Snipe IT is not a bad product. I I instructed my server team, there's 4 of them, to load Snipe IT onto a LAMP stack that I'd already built for them, basically, because they were like, oh, we don't do Linux. So I built the LAMP stack and got it all running, but I needed them to do the LDAP and stuff to actually, hook it into the network and that sort of stuff. Literally, while I was away on leave in November last year, they took Snipe IT. They ditched my LAMP stack. Obviously, CIOs can't be too technical. I don't know where the problem starts, but and they actually engineered it. They got online, clever little sods that they are. They got online and they worked out how to shoehorn the thing into an IIS environment so that they could actually run it. And so, even with direct instruction to staff that are directly reportable to me, they went out of their way, like a couple of days worth of serious effort, to engineer it in a way to give me the result I wanted to, but have the back end that they wanted to. That's the sort of cognitive dissonance that you're actually up against a lot of the time. It's an interesting story.
You mentioned something about monthly subscriptions are difficult to get your purchasing department to agree to. What so it's easier to get like a yearly contract with the one big fee.
No, in fact, it's actually a real problem because often when the federal government, which doesn't have a responsibility in Australia for healthcare, it's for secondary healthcare, which hospitals are, I should say. Often when we get projects funded from the federal government to do something, it often is, and this is where the capitalisation comes into it. It's often a certain amount of money to put in a certain capability as a project, and so the money comes in. It's then put against our budget, but we're very rarely given money to continue that project onwards. So often what I have to do is think, how long is this software going to be used for? Maybe 4 to 5 years. And I sometimes actually have to capitalise the whole project and I put the whole lot in. And so I will purchase a forward-facing agreement for maybe 5 years so that I don't have to pay a monthly fee and raise the operating costs of my department. That's the problem. And the problem is when you're mucking around with innovative small companies and you're trying something out that might be huge in the future, you can't do that. You can, but you're going to fall short because there's no way to accurately sort of anticipate where you're going to go with that technology. And so, it's a real bind. I mean, we got a considerable amount of money for, there's quite a gap between Indigenous health outcomes and or First Nations health outcomes, whatever term you like to use, and say the standard populace. We get considerable amount of money to do certain things, and it gets really hard to put technology in for this group because federal funding, it's a yearly based thing, sometimes maybe 3 years, but the life of the technology, I mean, our patient administration system is 40 years old at the moment. It's an old green screen piece of software from CSC, and it still ticks along. I mean, there are banking bits of software that are probably over 60 years old. Sorry.
So you have so much problem. How your service provider can help?
Well, I sort of...
Because I used to work for a service provider, and we had a lot of this kind of conflict with customers.
Indeed. And I sort of ran this session, it's a modified session from LinuxConf in Australia, to try and, it was a sort of a, how you as a startup can get money from us, the big government. And it got very depressing actually. But there are ways. Service provision can be done, but you're looking to make sure that, and not a lot of open source companies do this. They don't talk about exit points. So if you're going to go to a public sector organisation that needs to capitalise the majority of its budget, especially if you're being used for a particular project that might be funded from a different party, you need to say, look, we're going to provide this software. Say you're a SaaS provider. We're going to provide this solution to you for 5 years, and the cost, it is a fixed cost of this. And you'll need to leave it at that. And what that means is that the actual innovation risk is then put upon the small provider, which is very dangerous. I've been a startup myself, not where you want to be. You want people to actually pay for what they use, but quite a lot of the time that's what you need to do. But it doesn't mean that you have to be static there. You can call that one project. The biggest thing that kills small innovation companies and stops large public sector organisations from taking on that technology is scope creep. If you can get your scope sorted and you can get your requirements sorted and it's for a project, then that's fine. And if that particular, if say our health service wanted to use it for something else, you say, well, look, that's actually a different project. Why don't you find some more money and we'll give you another slab of the pie? I guess that's the sort of answer.
Well, what you say, you use LibreOffice, right?
Yeah.
And LibreOffice have a version every couple months. Every couple months has different bugs, right? So even that they want to, well, even a service provider want to fix the scope.
Well, yeah, I mean, Libre is not a really great example because we're using it for free. I'm still trying to work out a way of actually somehow remunerating what do you call it, Open Document Foundation for Libre. I still haven't worked that out yet. I've probably only got maybe 120 users of my 6,000 so far, so it's not a big problem, but I'd like to do something about it. But the majority of the funding I have is for the Office 365 project, so I'm in a bind there as well. But yeah, it's sort of shifting sands. But you're right, you never know where technology is going to go.
There seems to be a lot of talk, at least on the federal level, with DTO and those sorts of things. I mean, I came in late, so I don't know if I can cover any of this, but do you think that is going to help in terms of pushing it down towards the
very Australian-centric argument. So the DTO is our Digital Transition Office. It's part of our Department of Communications at a federal level. What my colleague here is talking about is there seems to be a change in our government, finally, to a more innovative approach. And we're all very excited in Australia because we're a little bit behind everyone else when it comes to innovation at the moment. And they've set up a special department to actually but be sort of a clearinghouse for innovation is sort of how I see it. I don't know, the DTO is too young at the moment to actually see how much effect it's going to be. The majority of their efforts seems to be with other federal departments. So as a state organisation, I'm not so sure. Our main federal sort of interface is through the primary healthcare networks, which is a federally funded GP doctor sort of push at the moment, sort of a primary care sort of situation. And the My Health Record, the National Electronic Health Record. And I haven't, and what I find interesting with your question is I haven't seen a DTO actually involved in any of that discussion yet, maybe because I don't have any visibility at the moment, and if they do get involved with that might really be interesting because obviously with the with the non-success of the last public health record, it might work out. Can I ask where you work or what space you're in?
I'm actually living here in Singapore, so
oh, okay.
I just have a passing interest in.
Well, I can hear the Australian accent, so yeah.
Seeing it come in and just taking a lot of learnings, I guess, from the UK and the US and all that.
Yeah, and I think when Turnbull set it up when he was Minister for Communications, I think he really was looking at the what was it? It was 2010 when they started there. Was it Gov? I forget what the name was. It gov.uk project or what? Anyway, their digital transition, and obviously the CEO of the DTO is actually from the UK who was working in that process. So obviously we've tried to scalp some talent there. So no, I'm really excited to be in Australia. I was away overseas in 2010, 11, and 12, running my own open source business intelligence organisation in Scotland. And when I came back to Australia, I got a little bit depressed about where we were. And it seems that we're moving forward finally. Yeah. If we've run out of questions. Yep, I think we've run out of questions. Look, thanks everybody. I'm around for the rest of the conference. I don't have business cards on me. I've already been completely pillaged for business cards, but I'll have some more tomorrow, and I'm around to talk to and all that sort of stuff. Thanks very much for turning up. Yes.
I noticed you've given this talk before at LinuxCon.
Yep.
And now it's at FOSSAsia.
Yes.
So basically you're preaching to the choir, right? Is there a way to make the public sector people more aware of these limitations and how their excuses or their reasons of their barriers are not as valid as they seem?
My hope was actually the opposite, was that to actually bring the open source community in from the cold and say, well, look, these are actually the expectations that public sector organisations have. Not that I feel I'm holier than thou or anything like that, but it's really that we have a considerable amount of revenue that we need to use for innovation. we only work with proprietary organisations. And this comes down to a really great debate we could have, maybe with 3 aside, is it our responsibility to seek out open source solutions because we're a public sector organisation and somehow coax the open source innovation into the organisation? Or is it the open source community's responsibility to aggressively go after our revenue and our issues and those sorts of things? I think it's probably a hybrid between the both.
That's true.
But the reason why I come to these sort of conferences to explain things is that I'm a diehard open source person, and every single open source organisation, I mean, the majority of open source organisations that I work with are just not on the page. They're just not consumer friendly. They're not trying to solve. They basically want you to meet them 80% down the road, and they don't want to meet you halfway, even if you are an open source person. I mean, I can tell you 100 examples of where I've tried to use an open source technology from a service provider, get their funny little hat and feathers, whatever you need to do to be a government supplier. I still think it's a dark art. And bring them in and actually, it's like dragging them in from the cold. Another process I've tried to use is we have an education database that we use. It's got a learning management system. There's a Moodle in there as well, but it's basically tracks courses that people have been on and what sort of qualifications they have. It's a learning management system, but a qualifications management system, and that was developed in-house. And we actually moved that into GitHub, and we get in from, we're co-located with James Cook University, and we actually get, normally we start off with a cohort of like 12 or 14, and that whittles down to maybe about 3 or 4 hardcore people, and they work on that project for us. And so we have an open source, and not that whole project has been implemented somewhere else, but parts of that project have been implemented somewhere else within Townsville, and I'm glad that that's happened. So even though I'm not remunerating them, they're really just getting course points and experience. It's one way of sort of getting more open source to happen. But I'd love. I mean, what it comes down to is another one was back when I was working for the private organisation in Townsville. We didn't have an electronic medical record, and I literally tried to put a cohort of about 5 or 6 Catholic hospitals together, and to either implement Open Vista or one of the other open source ERMs that are out there, electronic medical records, I should say, because the medical record, when you're implementing it, I mean, you're looking at about $100,000 per bed. So if you're a 650 bed hospital, just do the sums on that. It's phenomenal. And most of that is in vendor costs and vendor professional costs and change costs, which I think open source could be better at. And that's actually the theme of my thesis. So maybe next year I might come back with some learnings on that. Thanks very much for your time. Thanks, guys.